Okay, great. Well, I think we are your last presentation for the training. So hopefully you all are awake and ready to talk about DER interconnection. Cody and I are going to give you an overview today of this topic. So on the agenda today, I'm just going to go over some basics over what interconnection is and why you should care about it, and talk a little bit about the policy implications and actions that you all can start to think about and take to improve the interconnection process. Then I'm going to hand it over to Cody for the actual complicated technical aspects of interconnection and let him give you his expertise on that. All right, so to make sure we're all on the same page as we get started here, this is an overview of what interconnection is. And yes, it is basically exactly what it sounds like, which is physically connecting a distributed energy resource to the distribution grid. The term interconnection process then refers to all the steps needed to do that. The process is really important because DERs do have system impacts to the grid. And so it's really important that the utility is able to be sure that those systems will be safe and reliable when they do interconnect to the grid. And so in order to do that, they will conduct a study, provide legal agreements and terms, and check that the system is not going to have adverse impacts to their grid. And then they can also help to make sure that your DER is set up to be able to provide grid services and participate in different programs as well. All right, so why do you all care about this, and what can you do to help improve this interconnection process? To start, I think it's helpful to just ground our conversation in why improving interconnection is creating value for different players across the system. So first, and most importantly, you get your DERs onto the system more quickly. And for the electric system, this means that you can avoid investing in more costly resources and infrastructure. DERs can deliver valuable grid services to your system. You may see reduced emissions, and you can also see broader societal benefits like more customer choice in how they participate in the energy system. Second, customers will have a better experience because it will take them less time and cost them less money to get their system online. Customers invest a lot of money into these systems, and so it's frustrating to them when those benefits get tied up in a lengthy or complicated process. Finally, there are industry benefits. So developers will have better outcomes because they can more easily identify where they can actually develop DERs, and they have a better understanding of what it's going to cost them to do that. This overall easier and less costly process also has spillover effects. It can help spur an industry, help with job growth, workforce development, that kind of thing as well. So building on that, the different players in this space have different interests and roles in improving interconnection. Utilities, of course, have a lot at stake, given that these resources are connecting to their system. So they are therefore in charge of a lot of the interconnection process, including conducting studies and running the overall process. They're the keepers of a lot of grid and customer data, and they can often drive or at least have meaningful input into regulatory reforms and improvements to the interconnection process. Developers and customers are on the other side of the utility in that interconnection process, and they provide information back to the utility on what their system size is, where it's going to be located, how it's set up, those kinds of things. And then they, of course, work to provide information to the utility on how they plan to participate in programs and sign those kinds of interconnection agreements. Regulators set the rules of the road for interconnection by overseeing interconnection tariffs, requesting or mandating data sharing from the utility, and then by setting overall process and policy related to DERs and interconnection. State agencies like energy offices, consumer advocates, and permitting agencies also play a very critical role in helping to surface best practices, advocating for regulatory reforms, and then permitting agencies have that crucial role of inspecting and permitting customer systems to make sure that they are safe. Oh, I'm sorry. Here we go. That's that slide. Okay. So building on this, the different players, in many jurisdictions, the interconnection process is very timely and costs a lot. So with that in mind, DOE created a DER interconnection roadmap. They released it this January, and it focuses on 4 overall goals and provides actions that can help to solve interconnection challenges. It's a really useful tool. If you look inside of it, it actually breaks down roles and responsibilities and provides actions that you all can take based on your role in the system. So the roadmap is organized around these 4 goals. The first is increasing data access and transparency. The second is improving the interconnection process and timeline. The third is promoting economic efficiency. And the fourth is using interconnection to maintain grid reliability, resilience, and security. Each goal has high-level category solutions, and in total, there are almost 40 solutions that you might look at within the roadmap. So take a look at those. Many of them are complementary. Some of them are more ad hoc. So it's important to kind of take a look and see which ones are most appropriate for your jurisdiction. Okay, so let's get into a couple of the selected activities that you all might take. So goals 1 and 2 in the roadmap cover process improvements. These are activities that aim to smooth the overall interconnection process and reduce those bumps in the road and ultimately reduce time and cost to interconnect. Queue management, which refers to getting customers out of that interconnection process and the line and interconnected to the grid, is a really important solution, and it really requires a multi-pronged effort that touches on many of the other roadmap solutions and goals like improving data access and sharing and educational efforts as well. So a super important and foundational activity is improving data sharing. We've talked a bit about this throughout this training, but regulators can require better data collection and sharing from the utility. And as consumer advocates or energy offices, you can also ask for better data and suggest requirements for data provision as well. And as you consider what data to request, you'll want to think about a number of things. So first, what data do you and other stakeholders need? What do you actually use and what do you want? So for example, it might be helpful to think about what data developers might need for their process. Second, you might think about what data the utilities are requesting from developers, and then what data those utilities are creating themselves as well. The table on the bottom of this slide is an example of what a typical interconnection application might ask for from developers, and then what the utility can also typically provide or create in return. Next, it's also important to consider the trade-offs of what data you're requesting. Is it actually worth it to request this volume of data? Is the data sensitive, or will it be very costly to provide that? And NARUC has a really nice grid data sharing analysis framework. So it can help you to assess why you need certain data based on, and then based on that data that you need, you can help think, it'll help you think through sort of at what granularity you might need it, at what frequency, and what are the risks associated with requesting that data. And I've linked that on this slide, so do feel free to go take a look at that. As an example of good data sharing on interconnection, I really like New York's webpage. It's a central repository for statewide interconnection data. So it links to each of the utilities' interconnection requirements, their tariffs, hosting capacity maps, and queue data. And from this webpage, you can then go into each utility's data and get really granular information on which projects are in the queue currently, who's developing that project, where is it at, what's the system size, and really importantly, they also list out how many days in each step of the interconnection process that project has taken and what have been the costs for upgrades associated with that. So it's a really nice, transparent data repository that could serve as a good model for other jurisdictions. This is that example from Con Edison. So you can see there on the left, that's their hosting capacity map. And then within this queue data here, you can see they've broken it down by steps in the timeline and how each project in their queue is actually faring within the required days for that interconnection timeline process. All right, so there are a number of other actions that regulators can take to improve the interconnection process. At a very high level, just stating that interconnection improvement is an objective will help focus the utilities and other stakeholders' attention to the issue. There, regulators and stakeholders can set more specific objectives and performance expectations. The table on this slide shows targets from the roadmap, which are definitely ambitious but achievable for the next 5 years. They're focused around the time to interconnect DERs, completion rates, data provision, and reliability. And notably, the target from time to interconnection request to interconnection is 1 day for small systems. And so this really is an ambitious goal, and it's going to require a lot of streamlining and automation of our interconnection processes. To help achieve those goals, regulators and stakeholders can review the interconnection tariff and encourage other actions by the utility, like ensuring that small systems that are unlikely to have adverse impacts on the system can be fast-tracked and don't require full studies or more complicated reviews. And then as you review the tariff, definitely be sure to take a look at the maximum timelines that are set in those tariffs and try to figure out, are there ways that we can reduce those timelines or set more ambitious maximum timelines for interconnection. You could also associate a reward or penalty with those timelines and achievement by the utility. And then finally, there are a number of emerging tactics that utilities are taking to improve interconnection and trying out new processes. Encourage utilities to pilot or trial those attempts, those actions. And Cody will talk a little bit more about some of those when I turn it over to him. So as an example of this, in Hawaii, we have extremely high penetration of distributed energy resources. However, our utility there, Hawaiian Electric, was not performing very well on interconnecting those systems. And they were averaging a couple of months, or in some cases, even longer to interconnect systems. So the commission did not think this was acceptable and instituted a number of reforms to help them reduce this time. One of those things was public reporting of DER timelines. That's that graph on the bottom. And another one that's most interesting to me was implementing a performance incentive where the utility could earn rewards or be penalized for improving their interconnection timelines. And those have been pretty successful in a lot of regards. The utility is now down to under 2 weeks to interconnect customers on average. So it's a really big improvement on their side of things. So goal 3 in the roadmap is to promote economic efficiency and interconnection. And this means bringing down the cost to interconnect customers to all utility customers and delivering higher value with the investments that you're making. So typically per rate-making principles, if a customer interconnecting a resource incurs or causes the need for an upgrade, they will incur those costs. And this is called the cost causer pays model. This system creates a lot of challenges and can actually deter DER adoption in some cases. I have grouped issues with this cost causer pay models into 3 broad categories. The first is free ridership, meaning that anyone interconnecting after a customer has already paid for that infrastructure upgrade gets to benefit from that for free. And there are a number of ways around this issue or to help reduce this challenge. One option is to incorporate grid usage fees into your tariff. That means that customers would pay for using the equipment over time. You could also have future interconnecting customers repay that first customer who paid, or the utility could collect some extra funds from all interconnecting customers and kind of hold that in reserve for when equipment upgrades become necessary. The next issue is cost uncertainty. Without transparent grid data, it's really hard for customers to know whether they will trigger an upgrade and then what it will cost them to do that upgrade. So providing good grid data can be really helpful for this. It doesn't necessarily solve every problem because it doesn't actually reduce costs, but it does give a better sense of where the good locations to interconnect are. And this, you can also consider proactive upgrades, which we've heard a little bit about, where you anticipate DER interconnection happening, and you know you will need upgrades, and so you can do that proactively. And then finally, putting large costs onto a single customer can deter that interconnection. In a typical interconnection process, utilities study each project serially, so one after another. One solution that utilities can consider is grouping applications together in order to have a more holistic picture of what grid infrastructure upgrades are necessary and who is causing those costs. All of these mitigations are pretty nascent, but are being explored in a number of jurisdictions. As we just heard, Massachusetts is one of these. They're out on the leading edge of some of these issues for sure. This slide shows a provisional program that I understand that the department, the DPU, has adopted for cost allocation for interconnection. And I understand the program is that the upgrades, the utility can identify locations where they know that they will need upgrades, and then where they also expect that to be high cost. And so the investment, in order to be eligible, the investment has to benefit multiple customers and reduce interconnection costs to a level that the commission has deemed reasonable. And then finally, the costs need to be able to be reimbursed by interconnecting customers within a certain time frame, so it provides a little bit more certainty. Ultimately, this proposal aims to reduce interconnection costs overall and to allow multiple DERs to interconnect and help the state meet those ambitious policy goals. An important solution is coordinating interconnection with distribution system planning, our topic at this training. This is really important because, as we've heard, DERs and electrification are really costly need for a lot of investment and upgrades to the distribution system. So when the distribution system planning and interconnection planning processes are separate, it can lead to not optimal investments in the distribution system. So getting these two departments and processes to talk to each other can help to improve those outcomes. Portland General Electric's 2024 Distribution System Plan identifies a number of concrete goals around DER adoption and usage. You can see here how DER planning crosses over across multiple planning domains at PGE. Both the IRP and DSP feed into program development and budgets for DERs. And in the DSP, accelerating DER deployment is one of PGE's strategic pillars, and they identify standardized interconnection procedures as a strategy to achieving that objective. So the roadmap does identify a whole host of other activities that you might consider looking at and taking, and I definitely encourage you to tailor them to your jurisdiction-specific needs as well. Some of those are looking at your interconnection standards, which Cody will talk about, your modeling and tools that you're using for interconnection, and then looking at possible use of emerging approaches to like flexible interconnection or some of those group study approaches. I'm going to turn it over to Cody.
All right, thanks everybody. So today, following up from Grace's excellent presentation, we're going to focus a little bit more on some of the technical aspects of the DER interconnection process and the studies and some emerging trends, especially with regard to flexible connection practices. So first, I think kind of starting from what sets these interconnection requirements, most states or jurisdictions have defined DER interconnection rules and processes that cover a relatively consistent set of topics. So the process flow, the milestones, the timelines for applications, specific technical or equipment standards, screening and study criteria, as well as dispute resolution practices, among some others. A lot of states have these rules, but they vary really significantly based on sort of where you're at and especially what stage of the DER adoption journey. A common starting point for a lot of state DER connections was the NERC Small Generation Interconnection Procedure, the SGIP. You'll see a lot of these screenings, especially for smaller projects, follow the same general criteria from state to state based on those. And again, sort of the more DER adoption that you've seen or that you're sort of pressing into the system, the more sophisticated and the more sort of up-to-date and newer the standards and rules are associated with DER interconnection. Okay, so a couple of process examples that are linked here that show just some state-by-state differences. We have the Florida Administrative Code, the Illinois Administrative Code, and the Minnesota MNDIP distribution interconnection process. We're going to come back to these as some concrete examples, but the specific rules here are linked if you want to explore in a little bit more detail and kind of dig through the detailed regulatory language. Very exciting. Okay, so I think it's important to start with what are some of the process differences that you see based on the size of DERs. And I've got this parceled out. A lot of the terminology varies state by state, but I'm going to kind of do a small, medium, large approach. So for small DER, this is usually somewhere in the neighborhood of 0 to 25 kW, although it could be higher than that. Terminology for this type of process may be a level 1 study or a fast track or a simplified review. The terminology also varies a lot state by state. At this level, the applications get screened for site level things, may include things like known limitations in the area if you have sort of existing constraints, but a lot of times it's sort of, is the service transformer you're connecting to going to see any problems? And we'll look at what those criteria are specifically in just a minute. In terms of interconnection costs, usually for these small systems, they're relatively minimal, may include things like a service transformer upgrade, but you're not sticking them with a bill for $1 million substation transformer, right? When we look to the medium systems, this is a much broader range covering that kind of 25 kW all the way up to somewhere in the neighborhood of 500 kW or higher. Process terminology for these you may see is like a level 2 screening or level 3. This may also be called a fast track depending on what your level 1 process was called. You may see like a supplemental review in here as sort of an extra layer of screening for larger projects. For these, the screening criteria are similar and may have a lot of the same requirements as the small systems, but generally come with a couple of additional things to look for as you start to get bigger, which we'll again see in a little more detail. And then interconnection costs in this range vary significantly, ranging from still on the sort of minimal side up to hundreds of thousands of dollars or larger, really depending on where they're at and what sorts of constraints are there. Finally, the large systems, this is sort of nominally 500 kW and above, although there's a lot of overlap between that and medium. This may be like a level 4 process. You may hear supplemental review for these, or the feasibility, system impact study, facility study language is also relatively common. For these, generally, they are being modeled specifically in PowerFlow software. So you're doing a modeling run like we talked about yesterday. You are looking for issues. You're looking for specific types of criteria and generating interconnection costs from that for system modifications. In this range, you've got the full range of interconnection cost from basically nothing except for on-site facilities all the way up to millions, if not more, just depending on what the constraints are in the area. So state-by-state comparisons for our 3 examples. Maximum DER size, Florida for net metering is 2 megawatts, Illinois is 10 MVA, Minnesota is 10 megawatts. You'll notice the units are not consistent. We jump back and forth between MVA and megawatts repeatedly, depending on where you're at. Unity power factor doesn't really matter. A lot of times you use just the inverter kVA or kW as sort of interchangeable in this space. For Florida, the small category is anything under 10 kW. Illinois is 25 kW or 50 kW total nameplate if your total export capacity is under 25 kW, and we'll get into that distinction a little more as we go as well. And that's in the level 1. Florida again has the tier 1 process. In Minnesota, the small category goes through the simplified process. So 3 different states, 3 entirely separate terminologies for 3 similar but slightly different sizes of system. You're catching my theme here. The medium category, Florida's tier 2, 10 kW up to 100. In Illinois, it's the level 2 screening, which may be the expedited review or a supplemental review, depending on whether or not you pass a couple specific flags. In Minnesota, this is the fast track process, which is slower than the simplified process, but still relatively fast, and is based on size limits and voltage class. For large DER in Florida, tier 3, 100 kW up to 2 megawatts. In Illinois, it's the level 4 process, which is a feasibility study, system impact study, and a supplemental review. And then in Minnesota, it is the same sort of terminology, the study process, system impact, and facility study. And those are relatively common for large systems. Technical standards also vary a lot. Florida is still operating under the 2003 standard. Illinois nominally refers to the 2003 standard, but there are some sort of bolt-on smart inverter requirements. And Minnesota has fully implemented the 1547 2018 standard, which is awesome, and we will talk about more in the technical section. So you can see sort of broad strokes, the similarities and differences between the different states and their rules and requirements and terms for these different sizes. Okay, so I'll dive in Illinois what the level 1 and 2 screening criteria actually are. These are relatively common. You'll see them in a lot of different states. For level 1, this is mostly for small systems. Again, the aggregate export capacity has to be below the minimum load on the circuit. Basically, once you start causing reverse power flow, you start to see problems that may not fit well in the level 1 process. There's different requirements for like spot networks, so like dense urban downtown network systems that are very specifically designed and have reverse power flow types of protections can get complicated when you have DER. So there's screening for that. Shared secondary capacity restrictions of 20 kVA is mostly there to prevent like overvoltage from one customer adding DER, causing voltage problems for their neighbors. Not really a system level issue, but happens on the sort of secondary voltage level, depending on how much you have on a given transformer. And then an imbalance consideration, basically, if you have a 2-leg 240 volt service, don't load all of it on one and leave the other one sort of neglected. It creates lots of problems. So just you see these screenings are very focused on the sort of service level system, like individual transformer. As we get into level 2, on the right side, we're taking all the ones from level 1, we're doing those again, and then we're adding these sort of additional screenings that come in with larger systems. So you'll see like a fault current consideration here. You'll see what type of transformer connection is it connecting to for 3-phase services, and does that sort of match what it's supposed to? And then not exceeding sort of known transmission level issues or other issues. These are relatively common for like these types of medium and not quite large yet systems. Okay, so now we're going to talk technical topics, a couple of different elements of the standards and the study process and the DER capabilities that get considered. So I'm going to start with just a walkthrough of how all these standards have developed and what they are, because they get used a lot and thrown around a lot. I think it's useful to sort of start from where we were in 2003. So first of all, we have 2 different standard numbers that you'll see. The IEEE 1547 standard governs like DER interconnections across these different year versions. The UL 1741 standard takes those requirements from the 1547 standard and tells hardware manufacturers how to build hardware that complies. So they are inherently tied together, and you'll see that in the versions here. So the 2003 standard, basic, not a lot of solar going on in 2003, not really a problem, not really kind of considered, and subsequently, there's not a lot here, right? Basically, put in a unity power factor, you generate your power, you don't have to try to regulate voltage, we're just sort of tolerating that you exist. You're required to trip immediately if there's any kind of problem. Anything goes weird, just get off, we'll deal with you later. We don't want to see you try to do anything fancy. The hardware certification for this is just the 2005 UL 1741 standard. So as we've added more solar in some jurisdictions, start to see more and more of this, you start to see problems if the inverters aren't trying to play ball with the system. And that sort of gives rise to this 2014 standard amendment. So this was developed in response to voltage regulation challenges and bulk system stability challenges that emerge once you start to get way more PV than you ever anticipated under the 2003 standard. This includes things like volt-var curves and volt-watt curves. It also includes voltage and frequency ride-through to help facilitate bulk power stability, and we'll walk through those in just a minute. The hardware certification that goes with this is UL 1741 SA. So that is the sort of hardware standard that goes with it. That was an informal amendment. intended to be kind of a stopgap to stop things from going haywire. The 1547 2018 version is the fully baked interoperability standard that formalizes all of this and adds some additional roles and responsibilities for lots of different parties, including utilities and manufacturers, PUCs, among others. The certification that goes with this is UL 1741 SB, which is the current sort of active standard in the space. There's quite a bit of available inverters under that SB certification now over the last probably 2 years. So those are the standards. I want to dive in a little bit more on volt-var and volt-watt curves, which you guys should remember from yesterday. But the volt-var curve, the first thing is the thing you're measuring. The second thing is the thing you're changing. So we're measuring the voltage, and as a result of that, we are changing the reactive power. So when the voltage is too high, the inverter will act to bring it back down. When the voltage is too low, the inverter will act to bring it back up. Basically, you're trying to normalize it and kind of add a buffer against some of these issues in both directions. Volt-watt curve, same concept, but instead of reactive power, we're using real power. So once the voltage is too high, if you have too much DER or other conditions that are driving high voltage, the inverter will reduce the amount of real power that it generates to help bring that system voltage back down into compliance. Voltage and frequency ride-through are also really important here. Basically, the way that this works, inverters have to stay connected and generating in response to some system disturbances. This is sort of in contrast to what I was describing in the 2003 version, where if anything was sort of weird, they wanted them off so they could deal with it. Now there's so much that if you sort of trip all of your solar offline, you can create like these knock-on effects in available capacity and sort of make some of these stability and capacity issues worse. And we saw there's several examples of this out there of events where lots of DER trip offline, and it makes the transmission system much more challenging to try to deal with and plan for in dynamics. So that's what gives rise to these voltage and frequency ride-through standards. So we have high and low voltage ride-through. If the voltage is too high or too low, you have to kind of wait and see and stay connected until it gets past a certain window, and it's like, all right, something is weird, now you can trip offline. Same thing for frequency. If the frequency is too high, something weird is going on, but maybe don't jump off right away. Let's kind of wait and see if some other facility or system is going to act first. And then same thing for low. These are usually based on ISO or RTO recommendations for their bulk power planning and stability, those types of analyses. There's 3 different operating modes that are included in here that you'll see in these tables as well, that sort of tell the inverter what it has to do under each of these conditions. So in the normal range, when everything's fine, it's the continuous operation mode, which is basically do your thing. You don't have to do anything. Nothing's wrong. Just kind of do what you're going to do. We have the mandatory operation mode, which is basically don't you dare trip. And then the momentary cessation mode, which is sort of the stop operating, but don't like shut down entirely. Like once everything's back to normal, we need you ready to go, not 5 minutes from now, but like a couple of cycles from now. So it's sort of stop, but be ready for round 2, if that makes sense. And you'll see these kind of tagged in each of these ranges, and they vary by like how severe the condition is, what the expectation on those inverters is. Okay, I also want to talk about islanding. This is something we also talked about with regards to reliability impacts yesterday. Islanding is when a DER is energizing a portion of the grid that is not connected to the traditional utility source. And that could be intentional, it can be unintentional, it could be short-term, it could be long-term, but basically it's not supposed to be energized, or it is supposed, if this grid source is lost and that equipment is energizing a portion of the system. So if it's unintentional islanding, the DER is not supposed to energize the distribution system and has actually 2 seconds to get offline after there is a loss of source. So if there's an outage, those DER cannot continue operating in the area that's out. There's a fault there. It may re-energize down power lines. It may re-energize a system that's out for maintenance or that someone is actively working on and touching. You see the need for unintentional islanding protection. Intentional islanding, sort of in contrast, is where the DER is designed to do so. It can separate itself from the utility source and remain energized. So you're not re-energizing the distribution system. You are getting off of it, not connecting to it, and sort of re-energizing your own local area is the idea. This is the idea behind like backup power. You are physically disconnecting from the thing that is de-energized so that you can kind of do it yourself in the short term. Grid following versus grid forming inverters comes up in the same space. Grid following inverters basically require another source to latch onto. They cannot sustain without a source to follow. This is your classic PV inverter of the last many, many years that trips offline whenever there's a loss of source. They are system followers. In contrast, grid forming inverters act as a standalone source. These are what you would use for backup power. Like if you have a home solar plus storage system that has a transfer switch, you have at least one grid forming inverter. And it can operate in this mode when it needs to, but usually when everything's normal, it's operating in grid following mode. So we have your sort of follow the leader versus your captain inverter leading the system. All right, studying large DER interconnections, this kind of calls back to the modeling discussion from yesterday, but basically you build your distribution system base model, you model your minimum and maximum load cases and scenarios before and after the DER, and see what goes haywire. So when we're modeling DER in these types of studies, traditionally, you're assuming maximum nameplate output of the DER, you're assuming whatever reactive power performance you're requiring, and you're also modeling other DERs that may be ahead of it in queue. So in this process, the goal is to identify criteria violations and then figure out how to solve them. So I thought it would be useful to sort of map all of the individual criteria violations to what kinds of solutions actually get used to solve them. This is something that you kind of evaluate within the study process. Utilities may have specific rules and requirements and processes. Generally, you're trying to solve from what's the cheapest thing I can do, does that work, and then sort of escalating in cost. So if you have an overvoltage condition, for example, usually you're either changing the reactive power set point on the DER or adding new voltage regulating equipment or replacing or reconductoring to lower impedance. And that's sort of the intent behind these arrows. I know it's a little confusing to look at, but if you watch and kind of map them across, it shows which solutions sort of work for which criteria. Thermal overload really only gets solved by replacing equipment or adding new capacity. Voltage stability or rapid voltage change really is reliant on system impedance. So lowering impedance by reconductoring is the sort of preferred solution. Fault current risks may be changing protection as well. Unintentional islanding, again, changing some protection settings, adding different protection schemes. And then reverse power flow issues, having controls that enable reverse power flow and things like voltage regulators is the solution there. Okay, I'm going to close out talking a little bit about flexible connection. I like to differentiate these between static flexible interconnection and dynamic. So flexible interconnection as a concept is using things other than traditional conservative nameplate assumptions to connect loads or DERs. One of the more common ones is to use like a power control system as an example to set and enforce a constraint that is sort of less bad than the traditional. So if you have solar plus storage, traditionally you would study them separately and assume they're both operating in their worst cases at the same time. Well, you can set a power control system that says, well, I don't ever want that to happen. I'm going to set the actual maximum at whatever the solar is and then just self-charge and discharge the battery. That's one application of this. So the difference here, the static approach to flexible interconnection sets the limits at the time that they connect. So you want to do static flexible connection, congratulations. Here are the constraints you'll be operating under for the lifetime of your investment. Maximum output is this, maximum import is this. You good? Yep, cool. Sign the agreement, everybody goes home, does their thing. Dynamic allows for the performance of these resources to be managed by the utility in real time in response to actual constraints. So you can relax some of those conservative assumptions in the study process, but you may get a signal to curtail when there is capacity congestion. And I mentioned power control systems are one really common way to implement this. There's an existing standard for this, the UL 1741 power control system standard, which is a sort of a bolt-on to the inverter one. There is a forthcoming UL standard 3141 that has its second outline out. There's some equipment available that's certified to that now, but the full sort of consensus standard is still a couple of years out. Okay, so benefits of static connection: allows for more accurate and less conservative assumptions during the study, enables more DER to be interconnected at a lower cost. Doesn't that sound awesome? It is awesome. Couple of challenges: implementations and hardware may be more site-specific. There's sort of more complexity in how to design a site to follow one of these from a developer perspective, and how to sort of make sure that it does that from the utility perspective. There's some heartburn about customer equipment sort of being the lifeline to prevent issues from happening on the distribution system. There's some potential for redundant mechanisms or other means, and as the standards have progressed, it's gotten better. But that sort of backstop is still a little bit controversial. And some of these additional mechanisms that may provide extra insurance come with additional cost. Dynamic flexible connection, as I mentioned, sort of in contrast, things change in real time. The utility is communicating with and controlling the maximum import or maximum export in response to these actual conditions. There's a couple of good examples out here in New York. NYSEG and Rochester Gas and Electric have a really good report on their pilot and how that's going with some of these deployments that are relatively mature now even. And then Australia, distributed dynamic operating envelopes are a good example of doing this for groups of smaller customers with a sort of lower bar to infrastructure. So those are the two kind of pieces here. Benefits of doing it dynamically: again, reduced interconnection costs, better utilization of existing infrastructure, basically not taking conservative approaches and using what's actually there to the full extent that you can is really nice. Drawbacks: there are significant operational infrastructure required to stand this up, things like ADMS and DERMS, communications and control infrastructure on site. The interconnection process itself is way more complicated in terms of how much curtailment do you expect, and when, and how does that impact the customer, and what happens if it's more than that. And so there's a lot of uncertainty around this that has to be sort of settled in the process that can be really difficult to predict. Okay. Yes.
And then if there, people can read this.